Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books. And this is the third and final video on the Memories of Ice prologue. You'll probably be thankful to know I spent a lot of time on prologues. I do like them. So, as ever, there's going to be mention of Dead House Gates, there's going to be mention of Gardens of the Moon, but I won't go any further into Memories of Ice. This is it's safe to watch in terms of spoilers for Memories of Ice if that's the book that you're on. So what I wanted to talk about here, obviously previously I've spoken about the date, and I looked a bit at the Jagat and Imas section, and I wanted to talk about sort of the second half of the prologue of Memories of Ice. This thing with Krull and the gods and Kalor. So obviously, like the very first thing you know that I'm going to look at, which is the date, and the date once again, 119,736 years before Burn's sleep. We have discussed this. We've talked about how the specificity of the date is a sort of a giveaway that this is not a real date. This is a mythological date. This is a legendary date. So it is setting us up for what is about to follow as not necessarily an exact historical account of what happened, that this has been narrativized. It has been turned into a story in much the same way that Star Wars starts a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Erikson is signaling the same thing here with these ridiculously specific dates. So that being said, the first thing that I wanted to talk about was previously I'd mentioned about interconnectivity between these prologue, the prologue of Memories of Ice and the prologue of, say, Gardens of the Moon and Dead House Gates. I explained all of that level of interconnectivity. Erikson often talks about how he writes in an elliptical fashion, this idea of raising something at the start, it then moves through the transition of what he's talking about. He returns, basically, he uses that image again so that it reconnects back to the start. So if we think of the very beginning of the first part of the prologue, where we have Pranchol and Cannig Tall emerging out to look over a transformed landscape, a landscape that had been a sea and is now a plain. So it was a plain, then was a glacier, then became a sea, and now is a plain again. But transformative landscape, a destructed landscape or destructive landscape. What we have here is one figure walked this landscape alone. So we have again where Pranchol walked out onto this landscape and then is joined by Cannig Tall. Here again, we have a singular figure walking out onto a landscape. So we have a return to exactly the same action. We have this point of connectivity or interconnectivity between the first bit of the prologue and this bit of the prologue, that Erikson is doing the same thing again. So we see these patterns. And this is something that I think is actually really helpful when reading these books, is understanding that the patterns repeat. It's not necessarily exactly the same thing. It's not necessarily about remembering that person did this one thing and I have to remember that exact detail because that's going to be relevant. Quite often, it's much more that person did that thing. This person is doing a similar thing. And Erikson's going to explore the ramifications in a different way. It's learning the patterns. And one thing to bear in mind is it's when I do these analysis videos of the prologues, quite often I have not reread the novel. Like this novel I read quite some time ago. Now, in recording this, yes, I've read that, but I've read other things in the meantime. So I can't actually remember what happens. I'll look at it again. But in this, we have a point of connectivity where there's, again, the scene setting vista being explored, which is obviously very different to how both Gardens of the Moon and Dead House Gates opened. Gardens of the Moon opened with a very specific image that slowly panned down to a human scene. Deadhouse Gates was a very human scene that had a lot of symbolic meaning. But here we have these vast vistas. So thematically, again, think of what I was saying about how this has transitioned from the human empire focus of the first two prologues into something that is much bigger, that is something that's much more powerful, that is something that is more expansive. That we have the same thing here. And what we have here is a sort of Lapsarian tale, the fall. So if we think Lapsarian, is Lapsarian the fall of Satan from heaven or the kicking out of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden? Always get those two confused. But here we have the fall. So it's described in capital letters. The fall had shattered a continent. Forests had burned, the firestorms lighting the horizons in every direction, bathing crimson, the heavy ash-filled clouds blanketing the sky. Or sorry, the heaving ash-filled clouds blanketing the sky. The conflagration had seemed unending, world-devouring, weeks into months, and through it all could be heard the screams of a god. Pain gave birth to rage, rage to poison, and infection sparing no one. This is brutal, apocalyptic, destructive. And obviously there's, we could suggest a slight play on Star Wars here, because pain gave birth to rage, rage to poison. The dark side it was. But what we have here is this divine figure falling down as this comet and causing and wreaking massive havoc. But remember what I said about the idea of contrast in language. So we have forests had burned, firestorms lighting the horizons in every direction. So fire and light, but then bathing crimson. And bathing is this very soft, gentle, and usually associated with water. Bathing crimson, the heaving, ash-filled clouds blanketing the sky. So again, we think of firestorms and the burning, and everything's described as this light expanding everywhere. But then we have ash-filled clouds, which is this idea of being obscured. And of course, bathing and blanketing are both very comforting images, whereas burning and firestorm, that is very destructive. And on the one hand, you can say, yes, but this is, when you have a big forest fire, you have lots of clouds. But it's how it is being communicated to us. The conflagration, it seemed unending, world-devouring, weeks into months, and through it all could be heard the screams of a god. So, and here's an interesting thing. In the first part of the prologue, there was a whole aspect about motherhood, the Jagat mother with the two children, Kalava rescuing the two kids, Kalava thinking she was saving the children when she threw them into the rent. And of course, we'd encountered the rent previously in Deadhouse Gates with that episode with the Solanda ship and the Talana mass that we met there. So we know what has happened to those children. And here we have another birthing metaphor being used, another motherhood aspect, where pain gave birth to rage. So this is the birth of a pain, rage-filled god on this planet. And it ties into as an echo, not as the same. This is not the same, but it is echoing that element of motherhood, of birth, of the relationship between child and parent, where here we have this world we could see as the parent. And of course, the world has been personified as Burn, this goddess. And here's this deity child that has screamed its birth rage. The first cries of this god on the planet are screams of pain and rage. So a baby being born and that squealing that's generally heard. And they always see it in the movies where they slap the baby's bum so it cries, and you go, "Oh yeah, its airway's fine." You're like, you just slapped it on the arse. Of course, it's going to be crying. But here we have that this cry, this birthing cry, is one of rage and pain. So that's something to bear in mind, that again, it's coming back, it's linking to these things, that they are connected, but they are not necessarily exactly the same. It's finding points of connection as we're exploring things. Now, we also know that following this, one figure walked this landscape alone. So this is where we're getting into the point of connection with I said his name a minute ago, Pranchol. We're getting to the point of connection with Pranchol from the start. Wrapped in rotting rags, he was of average height, his features blunt and unprepossessing. There was a dark cast to his face, a heavy inflexibility in his eyes. He walked as if gathering suffering onto himself, unmindful of its vast weight, walked as if incapable of yielding, of denying the gifts of his own spirit. So again, we have this singular figure wrapped in rotting rags. Remember that Pranchol was dressed in furs and skins, and Pranchol wasn't particularly tall. That we're getting this point of connection. We're seeing that this is almost like a dark, in a mirror darkly, of what happened earlier. But we're told he's walking as if gathering suffering onto himself. What does that mean as a literal description? And when you think of it, you go, how does someone walk like that? And you go, well, obviously that's not how you would describe someone walking. So we must be thinking of poetic meaning. So start thinking about this, not necessarily literally, but think about it in terms of poetics, this symbolism, the feeling of what it's trying to get across. And this is what I was saying at the beginning, that we're not reading this as an exact, this is historically what happened. This is a fictionalized account, a folklore, a myth, a legend. And in that, we're getting that sense of the, not overblown language, but hyperbole, exaggeration of symbolic language, incapable of yielding, denying the gifts. So we get a sense in heavy inflexibility in his eyes, blunt, unprepossessing. The sense of this is of someone very solid, who is fixed in their worldview. Nothing can affect them. That they are convinced of their own way of looking at things. They are intractable. All of this is not something you would associate with, oh yeah, the flexible way of thinking about things. They're going to be agile in thinking about things. They won't have already made up their mind. We can convince them. This is someone who is already absolutely convinced of everything, and you cannot change their mind. And this, we are then told that this continent, or what at least what is left of it, would one day be called Corelry. Corelry. Let's go with Corelry because I can actually pronounce that. And we're told that there are some survivors, very few, but they maintained a watchful distance, curiosity dulled by fear, for the man was an ancient god and he walked among them. And this is where we get again that sense of evoking the mythic past. When a deity in this world is walking amongst the mortals, mortals fear them. Now, if we think of a lot of modern day religions, the idea of the deity walking amongst us is generally quite beneficial, particularly in the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic religions, that that aspect of God is viewed as a kindly father, strict but fair. And if God was walking amongst us, that's actually quite a good thing. But here is a completely different sense, and it's much closer to the Greek, the Norse, the Roman, the Mesopotamian, the Sumerian, all of these ancient cultures where gods were not necessarily nice people. And the prologue goes even further. Beyond the suffering he absorbed, Krull, which is very similar to cruel, would have willingly embraced their broken souls, yet he had fed, was feeding, on the blood spilled onto this land. And the truth was this: the power born of that would be needed. So we're told that, Krull is absorbing this suffering. And he would have willingly absorbed these survivors, just taken them into himself. Like, they survived, they're running around, they're scared, but he would have killed them and absorbed them into himself. And he was feeding on the blood spilled onto this land. He's feeding on blood. This is a dark god. This is going back to nature spirits, the blood sacrifices, the human sacrifices. This is not a god who you sit down, have a glass of wine with, and go, oh, so how's it going? This is a god that's like, oh, and how many virgins are you sacrificing to me this week? And in Krull's wake, men and women killed men, killed women, killed children. Dark slaughter was the river the elder god rode. Elder gods embodied a host of harsh unpleasantries. And that wonderful understatement at the end, harsh unpleasantries. Oh, yes. I do hate it when they leave the crusts on the cucumber sandwiches. That this is spelling out to us very clearly that Krull is powerful. Krull is a force of nature, a force to be reckoned with, and that he can be cruel. He is single-minded. He will do what he wants. And in his wake, inspired by him, humanity is killing itself. And all of this slaughter, all of this murder, all of this senseless waste of human life is a river of blood that this god is using to ease his passage across the world. And that is a tremendously dark image. It is a very powerful image. And if we think of how that is initially started out by this whole description of a god being called down, who has fallen from the heavens, is pain and rage. And Krull is set up in opposition. We have one god being called down, one god walking closer. We have this balancing of these two, this opposition. And the god being called down created all of this devastation. Oh, isn't he bad? And he's screaming in rage and pain and is an infection. And here comes Krull, and he's going to sort it all out by murdering everyone. Really? Not really coming across as a good guy, is he? But we then find out the foreign god had been torn apart in his descent to Earth. He had come down in pieces, in streaks of flame. His pain was fire, screams, and thunder, a voice that had been heard by half the world. Pain and outrage. And, Krull reflected, grief. So, that initial mirroring of bringing these two characters together at either end of that introduction to this prologue is then made explicit by bringing them very close together and having one contemplate the other. So we can see that what we supposed from the opening is actually mirrored here. And then we find out that what actually happened. And I'll come back to some of the other points in a minute. But the summoners were dead, destroyed by what they had called down upon them. There was no point in hating them, no need to conjure up images of what they, in truth, deserved by way of punishment. They had, after all, been desperate. Desperate enough to part the fabric of chaos, to open a way into an alien remote realm, to then lure a curious god of that realm closer, ever closer to the trap they had prepared. The summoners sought power, all to destroy one man. So it is clearly laid out in this paragraph. This god that was called down is an innocent victim. He was trapped. He saw this thing, came closer, and these mortals, these summoners, reached up, grabbed him, tore him down into this world, and tore him to pieces. And he rained down. His destruction on this world was unintended. He didn't mean for this to happen. He didn't intend to be here. He was brought here. And in bringing him here, the people that brought him here, the summoners, were all killed. So, they've already been punished. And why this is absolutely fascinating is because Krull then connects with Draconis and the sister of Cold Knights. And they go to see the emperor, the high king of this continent. And again, we have this very symbolic image of him, a pile of bones and skulls with his throne sitting atop them. And he is waiting on these three gods. So what we have here are the three gods going to confront Calor, the high king, the emperor of this continent that was horrendously destroyed by the falling of this deity. And just as a brief aside, remember we had the three Rannig, we had the three Jagat, we had Kalava and the two Jagat children, these threes. Now we have three gods, and the three gods each issue a curse each, so there's three curses. Then Calor returns with cursing each one of them, so there are another three curses. This repetition of three, and I know some people refer to like the rule of three. It's not a rule, but again, this is what I was saying about patterns, seeing these patterns and seeing how they constantly recur. And when we see this sort of patterning of this number three constantly recurring through these two aspects of the prologue, you go, well, Erikson could have chosen any number of Jagat to be there. He could have chosen a different number. This three, why is he choosing three? And we think of in folklore and fairy tale and in myth and in legend, this idea of saying something three times or knocking three times or the number three recurring in these things. So again, like the dates, this is encouragement to see this as myth, as legend, as not factually accurate. But the three elder gods blame Calor for the burning and incineration of this entire continent. Now, a whole load of the destruction was caused by the falling of the god. Calor, how much of it did he actually do? Now, Calor is an emperor. He's a king. He's the top dog. And these three elder gods have swanned up. Is he the kind of guy to go, you know what, this wasn't me, this all happened elsewhere? Is he the kind of guy go, yeah, you know what, this was me? Claiming credit for something that he didn't do. Which strikes you as more likely? The emperor of an entire continent that has been absolutely devastated, not decimated, not reduced by 1/10, devastated. It's been absolutely devastated. Is he going to claim, oh, well, that had nothing to do with me, and try and avoid blame? Or is he just going to go, no, that was me. What are you going to do about it? Because he's all powerful. He is trying to be a god king. And the three elder gods say, well, for this crime, for the destruction of this entire continent, we are going to curse you. And we're going to curse you with mortal life unending, but not eternal youth, which is a classic Greek myth. We are going to curse you so that you will never become a god, because obviously that's what Calor had wanted. This is a realm where mortals can become gods. So he's never going to become a god. And then the sister of Cold Knights curses him to say, no matter what you want to achieve, it'll turn to dust in your hands, that you will always fail. Which, again, is quite a strong allusion to, say, Sisyphus, this idea of eternal torment of never achieving the goal, but always having to do it. Or we could see it as similar to Tantalus, the idea that it's always going to be just out of reach. But there are strong allusions to legend, to mythology. And what is very interesting is, again, so these the three voices each curse him. So we have this three. And then Calor just looks at them and goes, you know what? I'm going to curse you back. Krull, you're going to fade from the world. Draconis, what you created is going to be your undoing. And you, woman, doesn't even give her name because he's a dictator. You are going to have your body torn to pieces upon a field of battle. And you go, that's a little specific. If you think of the first one, you'll be forgotten and fade from the world. Yeah, it's not particularly specific, but we saw in Gardens of the Moon that Krull had been forgotten, that people weren't at his temple until the assassin's blood re-sanctified it, and suddenly Krull re-entered the world again. With Draconis, we saw him trapped inside a sword. So we're getting a sense that Draconis and Dragnapur, the blade of Anomander Rake, may be connected. And then with the Sister of Cold Nights, unhuman hands shall tear your body into pieces upon a field of battle, yet you shall know no respite. That one stands out as something very, very different. And therefore, it suggests that this is a very specific thing from the books that is going to be revealed. Because that seems so specific. The others were kind of bland and generic, that there's not a lot of information there. But this is really exacting as to what's going to happen to her. And of course, after all of this, after this confrontation, Draconis confirms that he has been constructing a sword. And that again, so now we have that point of connection by the end of the prologue, that likely Dragnapur, Anomander Rake's sword, where Draconis is trapped, was made by Draconis. So Anomander is carrying an Elder God's sword. So in looking at this, one of the things I wanted to raise is, think of how Krull has previously been depicted. He hasn't been depicted as a cruel god. He's helped out humanity. Draconis talked to Perrin in the sword. He doesn't come across as a particularly cruel god. And we don't know about the Sister of Cold Nights. But when we look at this paragraph, or this prologue describes the gods in quite dark, unforgiving detail. And the narrative perspective of them, although they blame Calor, the prologue has been at pains to say that Calor is not actually the one responsible for this. The ones responsible, the summoners, are already dead, and Krull knows this. And yet they still try to blame Calor. So in some ways, this prologue is actually showing Calor, although he is arrogant, he's a human, he's a mortal. And three elder gods have just rocked up and gone, this is all your fault. And the prologue is almost suggesting to us, now, and this is what I was saying about, try to think about things that you are not being told. So here we're being shown it, not told it. Calor is being accused of a crime that the prologue has told us he didn't commit. So who is in the right and who is in the wrong? And what does that say about these three elder gods? Are these three elder gods being shown in a particularly good light? And that is a point that I think you should bear in mind when you read not only Memories of Ice, but the entirety of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Always bear in mind that quite often the narrative is telling you one thing and is showing you another thing and is asking you, think about it. And here is a perfect example of that. This continent was devastated by these summoners bringing down a god, and yet these three elder gods, who at any point could have stepped in, like where were they months before it happened? These were just mortals messing around. These elder gods have all of this power. They could have stepped in, they could have done something, and they didn't. They chose not to. And then a foreign god gets called down, the continent gets devastated, and then they go, yeah, the mortal king, he's the one who's responsible. There isn't a basin big enough for these gods to wash their hands of this affair. That it is very clear that they are avoiding blame by blaming someone else, someone they know wasn't responsible. And that's what's in the prologue. And that's what I wanted to talk about. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will catch you in the next one.